This is the National Broadcasting Company.
Hey, I'm Simone, and happy Thanksgiving, everybody. Coming up tonight on Signal. Wildfires have left a trail of destruction in California. We dig in to find out what's to blame. Plus, 50,000 soldiers practice for a hypothetical war. We'll take you over to Norway for NATO's War Games. And so, how was dinner tonight, guys? Awkward or maybe not? Why do we gather around a table on Thanksgiving? Well, now we're going to start with this. If you're black in America, it's assumed you vote blue. And overall, that holds true. According to the Pew Research Center, 90% of black folks voted for Democrats in the 2018 midterms. But what about that other 9%? I hung out in D.C. with two groups of black conservatives who look at the same country and see completely different narratives. Traitors. That's what their haters call them. So they retreat here. A secret group chat with other supposed sellouts. But they didn't commit a crime. They're just black Trump supporters. And this is their coming out party. I'm gathering this is kind of a judgment-free zone. Everyone can kind of just be themselves. And
I think it confuses some people. They see black people walking around with MAGA hats, and they're probably like, do they know what they're in line for?
Kalasia, Charisse, and Anthony bonded on social media. They're here in D.C. to finally meet others like them in person. As a biracial woman, I know exactly what it feels like to be misunderstood by your own people. So that's why I came here, to find out why everyone acts like black conservatives don't exist.
USA! USA! USA!
This is the nonprofit behind this meetup, Turning Point USA. They promote conservative values on college campuses. And you might know it because of them, Charlie Kirk and Candace Owens.
There is nothing more American than being black in this country.
But today, the crowd is here to see someone else.
Who in this room wants to be president someday?
President Trump's approval rating among African Americans hovers around 14%. In here, though, it's off the charts.
The African American unemployment rate has hit the lowest level ever recorded in the history of our country.
This is a recurring theme.
African American unemployment has reached its lowest rate ever recorded.
Trump deserves credit for his role in maintaining low black unemployment levels. It's been steadily declining since before he got to Washington. But beyond that, the picture looks a little different. The median net worth of black families is 10 times lower than white families. The gap between black and white home ownership is growing, and black college graduates still make significantly less than white college graduates. But for these students, this is bigger than just the economy.
Before even becoming a conservative, I started to feel like I was a victim. But once I got out of that victim mentality, I actually started thriving.
My biggest pet peeve is when people say, we've made no progress since slavery. Are you kidding me?
A lot of what I heard today was the narrative that Democrats really don't care about black people.
We sit in these really bad, dilapidated, broken communities. Democrat policies have continuously been implemented, and they have not worked.
Welfare reform is on the president's to-do list. And this gets to the core of conservatism, that liberal policies unintentionally do more harm than good. After LBJ created social programs like food stamps and Medicare in the 60s, the rate of black economic progress actually slowed down. They made progress, but not as quickly as in the 5 years before these programs started. Still, there are far fewer black people in poverty today than there were back then. But even if conservatives are right about welfare holding folks back, sometimes Trump makes things complicated. After Charlottesville, when he said there were fine people on both sides, do you think that was racist?
No one likes to see Nazis parading around singing Blood and Soil. That could have been handled a lot better.
Trump sometimes says things in the wrong way. I never feel like he's personally attacking the black community.
Not all black conservatives agree. We met up with Quadricos Driscoll. He's a Republican who teaches religion and politics at GW. Do you think it's fair to call Trump a racist?
I think it's fair to call Trump racist, yes. How I define racism is about power structures that prevent access to certain things. And so when we look at his policies and when we certainly look at his rhetoric, it falls in line to what racism is.
Why do you think we see such vitriol coming from other members of the Black community directed at people within this young Black conservative movement?
That is one thing I never agreed with. Black conservatives aren't going away.
He's right. This isn't some new trend. Then why are there so many culturally conservative African Americans who don't vote Republican? Well, it goes back to the end of slavery, when Black people did vote red. But just as they became Republican leaders in the 1930s, Hoover's administration kicked them out to appeal to Southern racists. It's when Roosevelt's New Deal came along that minorities saw a chance to turn their misfortunes around. And when Republican presidential nominee Barry Goldwater opposed the Civil Rights Act, that's when many Black voters switched to loyal Democrats.
Being a Black conservative, you kind of feel like you're the only one.
People have been really crazy, especially Black people. I had some people tell me to bleach my skin, kill myself, you're a coon, you're Uncle Tom.
It's like one thing to be called those things by like white people. When it's within your own community, it hurts.
And then there's Kanye. You didn't think we'd forget about him, did you? Before his fallout with Candace Owens, people here appreciated the visibility he lent to the cause and the MAGA hat.
This is our president!
I noticed on your Twitter you had that post about wearing your MAGA hat for the first time.
Yes, which was yesterday. It's giving me courage to stand up for what I believe in.
Here's the thing about the hat. When these guys wear it, it's an act of defiance that says we're not Democrats and we are not invisible. Look, people are messy, too messy for the simple little boxes society wants to put us in. And if someone doesn't fit, it's becoming much easier to dismiss the unknown rather than try to understand it.
America first! America first!
Well, as California battles some of the most devastating wildfires in U.S. history, the frequency and intensity of these fires has a lot of people asking about climate change. The last 3 years on Earth have been the hottest on record, and that has had impacts on geopolitical issues around the world. So our friend David Cantor from NYU stopped by to break it all down for us.
Thanks, Simone. The California wildfires are already the deadliest we've seen in California. Right now, climate change is creating the perfect conditions for these kind of fires. Extended dry seasons, higher temperatures, and those kind of wildfires aren't just happening in California. In the Mediterranean, for example, in the past couple of years, we've seen devastating wildfires. In Greece, just this summer, there were over 90 people that died. And last summer in Portugal and Spain, we saw fires that killed over 60 people. Another impact, getting more intense, more frequent, are heat waves. In Europe, they experienced a massive heat wave this summer. This is just one of several they've experienced over the past couple of decades. And those heat waves, they also impact livelihoods. So think about, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, often the poorest are on the front lines when it comes to climate change. If the place where you live becomes too dry, too wet, too hot, you're going to move. One of the drivers of the Syrian refugee crisis was an extended drought in the early 2010s. Another impact is coral bleaching. In the Great Barrier Reef, they've already experienced a 30% reduction, either because the water has become warmer or also because the ocean is becoming slightly more acidic. And we're expecting, if warming continues as it is, to lose anywhere from 70 to over 99% of the world's coral reefs by the end of this century. Up in Greenland and the Arctic, it's warming about 2 to 3 times faster than the rest of the planet. Sea ice is depleting by about 10%. As the ocean becomes warmer, the atmosphere can capture more moisture, and hurricanes and typhoons can become more powerful and devastating. Closer to home, Hurricane Harvey, record rainfall was 3 times more likely as a result of climate change. In New York, Hurricane Sandy back in 2012, the storm surge there was 27 square miles bigger than it would have been back in 1880 because sea level has risen 8 inches. So this all looks pretty dire. And the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change suggests that we need to reduce our emissions by half by 2030 and get to 0 emissions by 2050. Many countries are taking the lead. China, even though it's the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, they're also the biggest producers of solar and wind power. The Paris Climate Agreement, all those parties meet again in 2020 to up their ambition. Now, yes, the United States pulled out last year, but that doesn't take effect for another couple of years. So there's still a chance that the United States might stay in the Paris Climate Agreement. You can also take individual action, anything from taking more public transport to reducing your meat consumption, changing your light bulb, or perhaps even more importantly, just talking to your friends and family, because when people hear about these issues from people that they trust, they're much more likely to take these kind of things seriously.
So we've been hearing a lot about nationalism lately. Recently, President Trump spent the weekend in France for a World War I ceremony. During the event, the French president criticized nationalism, which was clearly directed at Trump. You know, America first. Well, some of our longstanding NATO allies are all, where does that leave us? Lucy Kavanaugh over at NBC's London bureau actually went to Norway to watch the largest NATO military exercise since the end of the Cold War.
Norway is under attack. At least that's what everyone here is pretending. It's all a big war game, a huge NATO operation where countries practice what it's like to defend an ally from an invasion. The bad guys aren't named here, but let's be honest, everyone knows we're talking about Russia. There's been so much talk of Russian meddling and disinformation that it's easy to forget about a worse Russian threat. Actual war. The likelihood of an armed Russian invasion of the States is basically zero. But we are a part of NATO, and that means if one country goes to war, we could all be at war. The question is, does that make sense today? First, a quick history lesson, and I mean quick. NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was created nearly 70 years ago to protect Western countries against the Soviet Union, now Russia. The idea was safety in numbers, outlined in something called Article 5. You can think of it as the Three Musketeers Clause. Basically, if Russia attacks an ally, even if it was thousands of miles away from our shores, we'd have to get in the game too. Today, NATO countries are training together in the biggest military exercise since the Cold War. It's called Trident Juncture, and it's a war game on steroids.
How ready are you guys for a hypothetical war with Russia?
I'm cock, locked, and ready to rock.
It's definitely impressive, but is NATO preparing for the right fight?
Election meddling, hacking, cyber threats. How has NATO adapted to deal with those?
Well, I mean, I think the alliance is the most successful collective security alliance in the history of the world. So I think it is adapting. Those threats that you talked about are difficult, and countries have to address them individually as far as, you know, election meddling, whatnot.
And American Marines are just as ready and willing to risk their lives and die for a country like Estonia or Bulgaria, as well as America?
I believe so.
This is Viking country. It's cold, it's muddy, it's really, really wet. And just like in real war, there's a lot of waiting around, a lot of time to think. The Cold War ended nearly 30 years ago. An entire generation was born in that time, graduated high school, even college. Did these Americans want to go to war to protect Norway? It turns out some do.
Do you guys think that America still has a role to play on the international stage to protect other countries, to keep up democracy, to protect European allies?
Oh, of course. You know, the United States itself is, let's not joke around, is the most powerful country in the world right now.
How are you?
Some Norwegian soldiers say they don't have the luxury of debating NATO's relevance. Russia is literally next door.
Do you think most Norwegians support NATO?
Definitely.
They think it's still relevant today in 2018?
Oh yeah, I think most Norwegians believe it's more relevant now than before. I don't want my kids to speak Russian. I want them to be Norwegian.
Understood.
Yeah. No surprise, but Russia takes a very different view and sees America and NATO as the aggressors.
Push up more if you have to.
Still, in recent years, Russia has done more than just provoke. It's actually gone to war with its neighbors in Georgia, Crimea, and Ukraine. But the streets of Trondheim are hundreds of miles away from the Russian border. It doesn't feel like the front line of a new Cold War. People are just going about their normal lives, not thinking about NATO. The alliance has been trying to change that. For Trident Juncture, it found an unlikely Instagram star, this guy.
Trident Juncture 2018 is the biggest NATO exercise in decades.
That's Lasse Matberg. He's a lieutenant in the Royal Norwegian Navy. He's also a former chef, a part-time model, probably the fittest guy you've ever met. And he has more than 500,000 followers on Instagram.
The feedback is positive. They're really curious on what the fuss is all about. And I'm trying to give like an honest picture or what I see.
Was Lasse winning hearts and minds? Maybe hearts. But I wanted to speak to Norwegians outside the military to get their views. So we went to one of the country's top universities for a chat.
To think about Russia as a threat to Norway today is kind of far-fetched for most people, I believe.
If you ask Norwegians, would you be willing to fight for Norway in case of a military conflict? Almost everyone, 90% say yes.
But are they willing to fight for, say, Estonia or Bulgaria?
It's a critically important question. That's exactly where, Norway can be drawn into a situation with Russia. It's via NATO. We're not a threat towards Russia.
Is NATO still relevant today?
I do believe so, in a bit, especially for smaller countries like Norway. We are, 5 to 6 million people, and if a big power like Russia were to attack us, we know that we have allies that will hopefully protect us and help us.
It's probably not a perfect alliance, but here's the weird thing. Even if it doesn't feel like it, we're living in one of the most peaceful times in human history.
Well, the midterms brought historic victories for LGBT candidates. More openly gay, lesbian, and transgender people were elected than ever before. Now, this happened as the Trump administration considers narrowing the definition of gender. Obama loosened the rules, and Trump's proposal would take things back to the way they were before. Only 2 options, male or female. I sat down with 2 people who are challenging this proposal.
Title IX gave a legal apparatus that trans and gender nonconforming people could use to give legitimacy to their claims of discrimination. Now that the policy is being restricted, there's no legal protections afforded for the compounded discrimination that trans people experience. That sends a message to employers, to public services, that it's okay to discriminate against trans people.
When you're talking about employment discrimination, what does that look like?
Oftentimes, gender nonconforming people like me are seen as not professional. So many times when we're applying for work, people will be like, well, we don't want someone like you in the front of the counter, or we don't want someone like you because you're making this about yourself and your appearance, your spectacle. They're just saying that they're discriminating on the basis of my appearance, but really that's my gender. And my gender identity is valid, 1, and 2, doesn't have any bearing on my ability to do work.
When you look at other countries around the world, are there any countries that you feel like are modeling the way that this administration, this country, could look at gender identity?
We've always just been so afraid of what's different, in this country. And that's what's happening here. It's just fear-based.
I think this country is actually deplorably behind when it comes to the gender identity conversation, right? So in large parts of South Asia, Nepal, India, it's actually legally recognized to be a third gender.
Mm-hmm.
Across Latin American places like Argentina, they have models around self-identification.
Being part of a community that our rights are dependent on which political party is in power is a really dangerous thing.
How would you like this administration or future administrations to acknowledge the fluidity of gender?
I think that one of the things that we've been pushing for as a trans movement for decades is self-identification and self-determination of gender. Since this memo was leaked, calls to a trans suicide hotline have increased ×4. It's very difficult to wake up in a society, in a country, where you're told every single day that you don't exist. Imagine tomorrow, you say, hi, and then everyone's like, no, you're not. The schools are like, no, you're not. The employers are like, no, you're not. And then your government's like, no, you're not.
I'm most afraid for trans and non-binary youth. My life, for the most part, is going to stay the way that it is. But the work that I do isn't for me specifically. In bathrooms and locker rooms, those rules and regulations are going to change because of this legislation. It's just blatant erasure of an entire group of people.
So when this news came out that the Trump administration was planning to narrowly define gender, what has the conversation been like in your circles?
I never watched baseball, but a group of trans activists actually did a banner drop that said trans people deserve to live at the World Series.
At the World Series. One of my first reactions was, this is Trump and the administration using this hate, fear tactic to energize the base weeks before the midterms. But at the same time, what he's doing is energizing our base just as much. I have never seen this community come together in a way so powerfully that fast ever before.
Black Friday is a huge shopping day for a lot of things, including guns. Did you know it's usually the biggest day of the year for firearm purchases? But it seems like responsible gun owners and gun control advocates can't even have a conversation these days. I mean, the gun control debate is so distorted by both camps that we can't even agree on basic facts. If you Google gun violence research after shootings in Thousand Oaks, Pittsburgh, Parkland, Chicago, there's no hard evidence that proves arming teachers will make our schools safer or that banning certain types of guns will lead to fewer mass shootings. That's because we don't have enough data to support these theories, whether they come from the right or the left. Scientists at the CDC have been trying to change that for almost 40 years, but something called the Dickey Amendment got in their way. This is a key piece of legislation that states no CDC funds may be used to advocate or promote gun control. It's popped up in every federal funding bill since 1996. In the 10 years before the Dickey Amendment, the CDC funded extensive research into the root causes of firearm injuries. And by the mid-90s, a man named Mark Rosenberg became the go-to guy for all things gun violence at the CDC. He and his team produced study upon study. This one found a higher risk for homicide and suicide when guns are in the home. The gun lobby called it junk science. And the NRA had enough. They seemed determined to block the CDC's $2.6 million cash flow. Either they do research or we keep our guns. At least that's what the NRA supposedly told members. We reached out to them for comment and didn't hear back. And that's where Jay Dickey comes in. He's the Republican rep and NRA member from Arkansas who sponsored this amendment. It technically didn't ban research, but it just made it really difficult for government scientists to pursue it. And CDC funding for gun violence research is down 96% since the Dickey Amendment took effect. So that guy Rosenberg from the CDC I mentioned earlier, well, these two were at odds, Dickey and Rosenberg. I mean, hardcore enemies on opposite ends of the gun debate. So they meet in person for the first time in '96. Rosenberg tells me it did not go well. 2 weeks later, they meet again, this time in Dickey's office on Capitol Hill. Rosenberg looks around and sees photos of Dickey's family on the wall. As dads, they find common ground. They become friends. Now, fast forward to 2012. It's right after the Aurora shooting where 12 people died in a movie theater and more than 50 were injured. Jay Dickey, Arkansas Republican, NRA point person, realizes the chilling effect his legislation has had on this research and reverses his stance.
What I'm regretting is that we didn't go forward and stop the funding of the gun control agenda and start anew a different investigation or research into gun violence.
Through his friendship with Rosenberg, he saw a way to pursue the evidence without the advocacy. And Rosenberg learns the science community needs to be upfront about their intentions. Just say off the bat, we're not trying to take your guns. So Dickey and Rosenberg write an op-ed together in the Washington Post. They're like, look at how we reduced motor vehicle fatalities. That's what we can do with gun violence.
Know that if you raise the driving age from 16 to 17, you save a lot of lives. We owe them the data.
Yep.
We need to be able to tell them if you raise the age for purchasing weapons, then you save lives, or we need to tell them it doesn't have any impact.
Virtually the same amount of people are killed by cars and guns every year. Government research into traffic safety led to seatbelts, airbags, and a legal drinking age. It may have saved about 600,000 lives. And we didn't even have to ban cars.
That when the highway industry tried to say, we want to stop head-on collisions, they didn't say, let's get rid of the car. They didn't say we're not going to have any more trucks on the road, and that way we can eliminate head-on collisions. we can find a solution without touching guns, I believe, without touching the Second Amendment rights that we have.
Jay Dickey died last year. Rosenberg says the NRA stopped returning Dickey's calls after he expressed regret. Now, Dickey's son and ex-wife, both Republicans, are working with Mark Rosenberg to restore federally funded firearm research. It would take a bipartisan coalition seeing the value in the science for that to happen. So I talked to Rosenberg recently, and he wanted to make this clear. Good research and solutions will look for ways to reduce violence while protecting Second Amendment rights. These two unlikely friends proved it doesn't have to be one or the other. Dickey and Rosenberg, name a more iconic duo. All right, guys, Thanksgiving is every American's favorite excuse to gorge themselves on turkey, stuffing, and an extra piece of pumpkin pie, of course. And you're probably pretty full right about now. It also means family time and lots of it, for better or for worse. Our friends over at NBC's Left Field tell us a bit about the history of the family meal.
Dinner time. 80% of America's dinners are eaten at home. 30% eat dinner with their family daily.
And do you get excited for big family meals at special occasions? A lot of people don't exactly love the big get-together.
In 2012, 12% of people dreaded seeing certain relatives. In 2015, 19% of people really didn't look forward to holiday gatherings. And in 2017, 58% of people just didn't want to talk politics. So,
you're not alone, and that's okay. Now, we didn't just crawl out of the cave and decide to spend a mutually unpleasant 20 minutes together. I mean, I'm just kidding. Family meals are great.
Would you rather eat a tin of mackerel or a tin of sardines?
That's like the worst would you rather ever.
As ever, the eating ceremony known as the family meal has a story. You ready? Here we go.
Before the 18th century, people ate in shifts. There was a bit of a vague setup when it came to rooms, and there wasn't a dining table exactly. The dining table comes to America via Europe and had to be put into a specific place, a new room known as the dining room. And in the 20th century, we get the nuclear family. And when they sit down to dinner, they become an icon of American culture, which encapsulates harmony and joy. And there's a lot of good that can come from the family meal. Young kids learned 1,000 rare words at the dinner table compared to 143 from reading out loud.
59% say family meals are the only times they can really talk to each other. You can save money. A meal out can cost an average of $15.37, and at home would be $4.31. Children are 12% less likely to become obese if they're eating with their family.
But this is a lot of pressure.
Yeah, it is a lot of pressure, and we have mythologized family meals and turned them into this symbol. This ignores the work and stress that goes into it. It's a pressure that is disproportionately experienced by women. It also ignores the inequalities that underlie it, especially for poor moms.
Combined with the pressure we're under to achieve something perfect, there are a lot of reasons that people dread family meals during the holiday season.
Here are the top least favorite topics to discuss. And the number one, people hate discussing politics. This has an impact. In 2016, Thanksgiving dinners attended by residents from opposing party precincts were 30 to 50 minutes shorter than same party dinners.
So some are opting for avoidance.
When family fails, you've got something else to turn to.
Whether or not it's related, if you look at searches for the term Friendsgiving, of course there's going to be a peak every November, but there's been a steady rise in the past 5 years. Look, no matter what you dread, 9 out of 10 people are gonna have Thanksgiving with their families. At the end of the day, family meals at holidays or any other time don't have to be perfect to still be a good thing.
Well, that's our show for tonight, everybody. I hope you had an amazing holiday, and we will see you next week.